I'm going to talk about some of my research. I've been at the University of Minnesota since 1989. I spent 7 years at Bell Laboratories. Most of you probably haven't heard of it, but that was the best research facility the world has ever known. And I came here because this department does both material science and chemical engineering, and it's that diversity of intellectual pursuit which is the reason I thought this would be an outstanding place to come. So I have a lot of different projects in my research group. Most of them deal with polymers. And so I'm going to pick a slice of what we do today. I'm going to go through a bunch of slides and tell you a little bit of a story about why we work on a particular kind of polymers called sustainable polymers. And I'm going to supposedly go about 20 minutes. You never know when I get going. I'm liable to talk a lot more. But the idea is if you've got some questions or interests, I don't even care if you interrupt me. I think in TED Talks you're not allowed to interrupt. But I know how to shut you off if I think you're getting out of hand. All right? So the work that I'm going to talk about is supported by the Center for Sustainable Polymers. The chemistry department, Chemi Mat Sci, 2 years ago, attracted a big NSF center, the only one they gave out in all of chemistry that year, to study sustainable polymers. And I'm going to try to convince you that this is something worth doing. The first thing I'll remind you of is that today polymers are indispensable. The places they show up in our personal lives, in items of commercial practice, are enormous. So the Dreamliner is about 80% made out of plastic. It's an incredible statistic because they're light, they're strong, you don't have to rivet them together. Windmills are made out of strengthened epoxy. If you go into an electronic circuit board, the circuit board is made out of a polymeric material. Babies are not made out of polymers. No, they actually are. Most of us are made out of mostly polymers, right? And certainly the high functional parts, DNA, proteins, they're all polymers. Those are not the kind of polymers I generally work on, but you get the idea. They're indispensable. And so I'm going to focus on the most generic, the simplest, but the most important commercial polymer. That's made by taking ethylene, simple carbon-2 with a double bond, and with a catalyst turning it into a longer chain molecule with some n number of these repeating units. And if you made a little molecular model, a piece of it would look like this. If you make n about 30 to 40, you get something you're very familiar with. You get wax. Candles are made out of short, what I would call polyethylene. They're oligomers. And as an example, I take paraffin candle wax, one with a particular carbon-31 length. It has a melting temperature of about 40 degrees, and it boils at 370. And so it's immediately obvious why a candle works. You get a flame started, and it makes heat, and it melts the wax underneath. It vaporizes, it feeds the flame, and you get a very nice steady feedback. And this was worked out, obviously, a long, long time ago. So if I make a picture of what a polymer, I'll come back with, a oligomer wax crystal would look like, it would be these C31 long saturated hydrocarbons. They stack up and make a crystal. And if you look down the top, they have a beautiful herringbone pattern for the packing of the molecules. If you do a computer simulation, you put a little jiggling in, this is what that wax would look like. And because of this solid crystalline form, wax has a waxy feel, but it's also very hard and unbelievably brittle, right? So this is an interesting material if you want to make a candle. What happens if I increase the length of the chain? I go up to 1,000, sometimes to 500,000 of these carbon atoms, and give you a sense of what that actually looks like. I brought and maybe I can get a little help from my colleague, Professor Layton. He needs to learn a little more about polymers anyway. This is a bead candle. This is a lampshade with a bunch of beads. You take that end, and I'm going to have this end. You walk back there and get out of my way again. Right? This is He's pulling that along. Wow, we're doing okay. Okay. Good job. This, if these beads were CH2 units, would barely be a polymer. This is 3,200 beads. I start with 1,000. So this would be a low molecular weight polymer. All right? You get a sense of what that means. Come on, bring it back up here now. Yeah, walk it down there. I like this. I've got him on a leash. This is what you do in TED Talks. All right? So we bring this thing down here. I don't want to get it all too tangled up, but you get a sense of what the molecular aspect ratio, or the dimensions, thank you, the dimensions, give him a hand, will you? What the dimensions of a polymer molecule look like, and they're very different than wax. If I take that long molecule and I put it in a solid state, I make it into a piece of plastic. This is a piece of polyethylene. It will look like this, and it has a melting temperature now of about 130 degrees. You might have thought, because the chains get really long, the melting temperature would go to almost infinity. But it doesn't. And part of the reason is when we melt the polymer, now I have a computer simulation, not mine, of what it would look like. It would look like this. All bundled up and coiled back. When I melt it, it doesn't look like the huge long chain. Entropy drives it to do this. But if I were to track a single molecule, it would be walking around like this. And then if I cool it down below the melting temperature, it wants to form a crystal. But because of the long chain nature and the kinetic barriers to folding up and making crystals, it ends up developing 4 different length scales of structure. This is amazing. A CH2 linear chain folds up locally. It crystallizes just like wax. And then in order to kinetically get into space in a reasonable amount of time, it ends up folding into units that are about 5 nanometers long. And this long chain ends up making this chain-folded morphology, leaving amorphous rubbery parts layered with hard wax-like crystalline parts. And then on an even longer length scale, it draws this layered structure out. This sort of thing was only worked out in the 1960s, understanding the way this polymer actually configures itself. So simple polyethylene makes complicated morphology, and it gets worse than that, or better. I'm going to argue both types today. There are many kinds of polyethylene. The one I just showed you is this long linear chain, and I showed you how it folds up and crystallizes. That's called high-density polyethylene. You can get it up to about 80% crystallinity. I'll show you a product in a minute. But if I devise the chemistry, and this is chemistry that was cooked up in the 1980s and 90s, it's still evolving, to put little short branches in the molecule, they would look something like this on the molecular scale, little ethyl or butane side chains. They sort of guide and break the crystallinity up in ways that modify the amount of crystalline and the amount of rubbery material. And then if I go to what's called low-density polyethylene, that's the stuff you make plastic bags out of. Now they're really soft, and you take a garbage bag, I can take this, it's actually elastic. I can stretch it. You know how that works. I can stretch it. That material has an unbelievably complicated long-chain branched molecular architecture. So there's actually, roughly speaking, 3 grades of polyethylene. In the recycling business, I've discovered they call linear low-density polyethylene the same symbol as low-density polyethylene. That's actually bad for recycling because these chains don't mix so well when you melt them and try to blend them together. Crystallinity goes down because the number of defects and the ability to fold up those molecules gets worse when they get branched. So what do you make out of polyethylene? Everybody knows about a plastic bag. This plastic bag has less than 8 grams of polymer, and the polymer costs about 50 cents a pound. How many grams in a pound? Over 1,000, right? That means it's very cheap to make a plastic bag. On the other hand, if I make a medical grade high density polyethylene and I go out to get an artificial hip, which could happen soon, I'm going to get a device with titanium, and the soft but still stiff sliding bit of that hip is made out of high density polyethylene. They do other things to it, but it's high density polyethylene. Believe me, you do not pay 50 cents a pound for that material. I can sell that material for a lot of money, which means I make a lot of money. I can also make another product. Natural gas pipelines are all made out of high density polyethylene now. They put them under the road. They don't rust. They don't corrode. It's really an interesting, useful product. How about linear low density? That's what the little branch is. Well, these are the most highly engineered modern polymer molecules around. These things are devised to either have nice, clear, soft, pliable form that can be actually extruded into film. A week and a half, 2 weeks ago today, I went to the Ziploc bag manufacturing site in Michigan. Unbelievable facility. Huge lines. They extrude and run the plastic sheet at 600 feet a minute. All integrated. You put in polymer pellets on one side, the huge factory, and out the other side come boxes with Ziploc bags. They weld on the piece that you can use to seal them. Amazing technology. You can also make very mechanically tough materials like this. I brought a sort of example here. This is an Nalgene bottle. This is linear low density polyethylene. Stuff is unbelievable. It's basically wax with a layer of rubber between every crystal. This one is more like high density polyethylene. I actually checked. It's a little stiffer. It'll be a little more brittle, but still terrific. And here's an example of how they make the polyethylene bags. So this is the linear low density limit. They feed the polymer melt from big extruders into this manifold, out a slit die. They blow it with high velocity air. They pressurize it. This is basically like making bubble gum in a continuous stream. They pull it up, it crystallizes, they fold it, they cut it. Huge volume, all done with very inexpensive, cheap material, and that's how you make plastic bags. So let's go back down to the molecular level. Let's see if we can understand where these mechanical properties come from. We study this in my group. And what we'd like to know is if I make this semi-crystalline, this is sort of a natural nanocomposite. This was a nanocomposite before people made that word up. Nature, if you can believe that, synthetic nature, right, naturally folds up the material like this, but it turns out it's not quite that simple. The synthetic chemistry produces a wide variety of chain lengths so that some of the molecules might be floating, some of them run from one crystal to the other, some of them are dangling ends, and if I take that material and I stretch it, I want to know if it's stiff or it's soft. I want to know what it does. So here's my molecular model. The crystals are hard like the wax, and then I'm stretching the molecules. And if I really want to engineer this material, and this is the cutting edge of research in polyolefins, I want to have a catalyst that makes the right mix of long, entangled, or bridging red molecules, the right number of shorter, amorphous, rubbery green ones. How do I know which molecule is stretching, which one is not? Well, the way we study that is with neutron scattering. So this is a picture of the guide hall at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where they have a 20 megawatt reactor back here, and they bring neutrons out. They filter them through a velocity selector so they get a single energy or wavelength. They pass them through a collimator, and then they go through the sample and into a 20-meter long, 6-foot in diameter tank that has a neutron detector that you can move around. Now, this instrument was built in 1990, and I'm happy to say when I came to the University of Minnesota, I actually shook the dean down for enough money to have Minnesota co-invest in building this machine. There's a whole bunch of other neutron machines out in the facility. So I came here, and we get time every year to work on this machine. You can do a lot of other kinds of neutron scattering. In fact, just 2 days ago, I tried to sign up for some neutron time. They give it to us for free. This was a great investment. And this is a true story, Chris. I was told 2 days ago that all our time on this machine has been used up. I said, I haven't been there. He says, no, but Leighton's been there 11 days this year. He burned up my neutron time. So I'm glad he's sitting back there. So what do we do with this machine? Where you see the sample, we have a device that Exxon built. This is a collaboration between ExxonMobil and the University of Minnesota. We have a device that allows us to stretch the material at a defined rate, a defined strain. It's actually a special kind of stretch ratio. And we shoot neutrons through, and those neutrons scatter from the molecules. There's some technical detail. We have to deuterate them and specially prepare them. But we get scattering patterns out. And all I want you to see is that pattern is anisotropic. It has intensity of neutrons that are perpendicular to the direction we're stretching the material. And by doing that, we're able to actually determine which molecular weight of polymer is actually being deformed on a molecular scale when we stretch the material. Fantastically powerful technique. Last week we submitted a publication. We submitted a paper for publication that came out of this. So I love the analogy. I mean, I love the comparison. We're working with this incredibly interesting fundamental neutron scattering big machine to understand how to improve plastic. That's only 50 cents a pound. But then I'm going to show you in a minute, they sell $200 billion a year of this stuff. So if you improve it by 1 cent, you make a lot of money. This is what I'm talking about. Polymers are a huge industry. Right now, annually worldwide, there are about 400 billion in polymer sold. About 70% of that is polyethylene and polypropylene. Polypropylene is a variant in some ways of polyethylene. Huge business. But in spite of all this beautiful molecular engineering, we have a problem. You all are familiar with the fact this stuff is so good, if you throw it in the ocean and come back in 400 years, it'll probably still be there. That's a problem. So we have wonderful materials engineering, and we have a problem. So I love it. I'm going to, hopefully get famous working on both sides of this problem, right? That's what you do if you're a good academic. We want to learn how to make the polyolefins better. We actually want to figure out how to recycle them better. I'm not going to tell you about that part of the work. What I want to do is ask, can we do better than this? Is there a way to alleviate the litter problem, the landfill problem? And the answer is, we need to find a way to develop polymers, hopefully that come from nature and go back to nature when we're done using them, that don't end up as litter. And the secret to that, we believe, lies in harvesting natural supplies of monomers. And how do you do that? Instead of having a petrochemical plant and an oil refinery, what we want to do is we want to take nature's sugar or cellulose, we're going to put it through a metabolic refinery, and out the other side are going to come a new breed of monomers, not CH2, but something called lactide, which is dimerized lactic acid, or beta-methylvalerolactone. This molecule, in the form it's made, was invented by Kachun Zhang 4 years ago in this department. Kachun Zhang, a recently tenured professor of chemical engineering, has a brain. His brain looks like this. I came to him 4 years ago and I whispered in his ear. I said, make me a substituted lactone that doesn't crystallize. And 8 months later, he had a bacteria that spits this stuff out. Unbelievable. I have no idea. All I know about this, my bio understanding, is I know there's something called the Krebs cycle. And there are 14 steps in it, if I recall. All right? But I'm a bio guy now. Because what we do is we hopefully provide the motivation for people like Kachun to develop an alternative source of feedstock, and I'm going to show you there's something special about these molecules. This is Kuchun Zhang at the bioengineering facility in St. Paul. We actually scaled up this reaction to 500 liters. He made 44 kilograms of beta-methylvaleriolactone when we did this experiment. It's actually economically viable. This beta-methylvaleriolactone can be made not quite as cheap as polyethylene, but you can probably make it for $2 a kilogram. That's $1 a pound if you scale it up using good chemical engineering principles. So why does this work? Well, instead of just having carbon and hydrogen, we now have oxygen in the backbone. These are ester functionalities. Those ester functionalities can be attacked by water and broken. You want to compost these materials in the presence of a base catalyzed, reversal of the ester bond, and that allows you to recycle the materials in a way that avoids litter altogether. And in fact, you can buy cups made out of PLA now. They make about 1 billion pounds a year of this. NatureWorks right here in Minnesota, started by Cargill and Dow, is the biggest supplier of PLA, and they're out there competing with polystyrene. And as I said, it's compostable. You put it in a compost heat, you throw a little lye on it, come back 6 months later, it's getting towards carbon dioxide and water. So we've taken carbon dioxide and water and a little sunlight, we've made sugar, we make a polymer, we put it back to nature. But we got one big problem. It's brittle. I went downstairs today and I grabbed a couple of the lovely recyclable forks that we have in the department, very environmentally conscious, and a couple of the polystyrene ones. The polystyrene ones, they're pretty good, pretty tough. I can break it if I need to. This thing, it's kind of like candle wax. Look at this. You ever have one of these nice recyclable tools, and then you're trying, how about the soft ones? You take one of these knives and you go to cut a tomato and it just bends over. Anybody ever have that happen? This is a problem. So we have a nice recyclable material, but it doesn't have the right material properties. So we have to do something about that. And I went on this morning and I looked up one of these word clouds. You see, I've become a very trendy guy. I actually know what a word cloud is. But actually, I put in there polymers, and this word cloud came up, and one of my favorite words came up, copolymers. How do we make the candle wax, the crappy mechanical material, how do we make that tough? Well, this is my favorite topic. Instead of using one polymer, we can cheat and we can cobble together more than one kind of polymer. These are petroleum-based, but the idea is general. We can take something that's glassy or rubbery, that's natural rubber, polyisoprene, or semi-crystalline material like polyethylene oxide. And the chemists now, they're very bright. They can figure out how to cobble these things together into molecular architectures that then duplicate that toughening mechanism of crystalline layers with rubbery layers. In fact, these architectures can be designed to make astonishingly interesting nanostructured materials. This was an article my colleague Glenn Fredrickson and I wrote now it's 17 years ago, where we were speculating on where the world would go with these tri-block terpolymers, 3 different functionalities, chemically different. They want to separate, but they're still attached to the same molecule. So they self-assemble on a molecular scale. The molecular scale is 10 to 20 to 30 nanometers. I put a scale bar up there, and depending upon how much red and how much blue and how much green, all these morphologies have been realized in practice. And you can imagine, if you make this one with a crystalline and a rubbery and a glassy bit, you can tailor the material properties. And that's the game that we play. Well, we got kind of out of hand. I had a postdoc a year ago. I said, look, we got to make this PLA better, and I want you to use a multi-block polymer strategy. And the postdoc went out and said, and I want it to be fully sustainable. Okay, we're doing other research on molecules like this. This is a derivative of cellulose, hydroxypropyl methyl cellulose. You put methyl and hydroxypropyl groups on the R groups. You know, cellulose comes with 3 alcohol groups per sugar moiety. So they substitute on that. This is a billion-dollar business for Dow Chemical. You make water-soluble gelling methyl cellulose. The postdoc went over and grabbed some of this from the student doing the research and said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use the leftover hydroxyl groups. I'm going to grow a blue chain and a red chain. I'm going to grow the polymer that comes from Cachun's beta-methylvaleriolactone, and then I'm going to add the semicrystalline PLA. So I'm going to have a giant molecule with these side branches, and because these red PLAs are dangling, it turns out they can crystallize. That's good. That gives me stiffness. And then the blue part is the rubbery PMVL that comes from our in-house fermentation product. This is entirely sustainable. You can compost the rubbery and the semicrystalline, and the backbone is a derivative of cellulose. Here's the punchline. We made this material with about 70% PLA, that's the semicrystalline red part, and about 30% of the PMVL rubbery stuff. The backbone is a very small fraction, 1% of the mass. It plays an important role, but it's a very small part. And we've got a bunch of stress-strain data here. I'm going to focus on this red one, which is an example of molded samples. This is a molded sample. You notice it's clear. It's actually crystal clear. And the reason is because the morphology is nanoscale. And you probably all know the wavelength of light is submicron scale. So if you make the structure small enough, it'll be clear because it can't diffract light. That's good for packaging. If you take this sample and you stretch it, you can stretch it to 600% strain, and it doesn't break. It breaks after 600%. It actually strain hardens, and you notice it doesn't lose clarity when you stretch it. Most plastics, when you stretch them, they get white and kind of ugly. This is some kind of underlying deformation mechanism we don't yet understand. But wow, this is a material that looks very promising. We just published this work a few months ago. So what is it doing? This is what we've done. This is what we do in my group. We've designed molecules that can be configured on a nanoscale. That's what polyethylene does. It self-assembles into nanoscale morphology. And this one crystallizes in a different way, but it chain folds. And we've guided that formation by the molecular architecture. And the key was using this backbone of hydroxypropylmethylcellulose and guiding the structure. And sure enough, when we mimicked what happened with polyethylene, we got something very interesting. This is what we call polymer science and engineering. But it's a field that's intrinsically embedded in chemistry and physics, in chemical engineering, and material science and engineering. I just showed you a bunch of stuff, right? I showed you a neutron reactor. I showed you stress-strain curves. We did crystallography. We did chemical synthesis. So all of these ingredients go into this field. And that's what I do for a living. I'm open for questions.